Within the realm of fantasy, numerous roles exist that help to push forward the narrative and provide context for the various actions that end up being taken. Many of these roles help to define a character as either being on the side of good or evil, but there are also roles that sit somewhere in the middle, creating an air of ambiguity about what might serve as a source of motivation. As Final Fantasy has built out, those narrative roles have sometimes found themselves associated with job classes, and one of the more interesting in that regard has always been the Dark Knight. Due to the job class's close relationship with negative thoughts and emotions, actions taken as part of the narrative were often portrayed as immoral, and their combat prowess was based around extracting the essence of either themselves or their target to assert their dominance. But even though that may be the case, Dark Knights, at least within the realm of Final Fantasy, are not inherently evil, and many have ended up being Warriors of Light as opposed to the aggressors that the Warriors of Light oppose. Throughout this video, we will look to explore the very soul of the Dark Knight, as even though the job class has seldom appeared throughout the main numbered games, it has still managed to make a significant impact, and we can't wait to explore this topic with all of you. So strap yourselves in as we explore the complete evolution of Dark Knights.
We stole a crystal from people who had done no wrong. I've worn this darkened armor for so long now. There's no mode of light left in me. Not even in my heart.
The first canonical Dark Knight was seen within Final Fantasy II. Appearing as a party member at the start of the game, Leon fought alongside Firion against the Empire, but after being separated and subsequently incarcerated, Leon was brainwashed and ended up succumbing to the will of the Emperor. Now reborn, Leon was manipulated into serving as the Emperor's Dark Knight, and in this role, he himself was able to manipulate and harness dark energy in order to not only make himself stronger, but to bend others to his will, as shown by his control over the entire town of Bafsk. From a gameplay perspective, when Leon later rejoined the party, he had high strength and high intelligence, denoting not only his abilities in physical combat, where he had an affinity with swords and axes, but also with black magic. But outside of those specific traits, due to the wider mechanics adopted by Final Fantasy II, there was nothing inherently unique about Leon from a gameplay perspective, and most of his Dark Knight charm was evidenced by his cold-hearted nature and black armor. Final Fantasy III attempted to build upon what had been established in the previous game, but in the original Famicom version, it wasn't anywhere near as clear as it has been made in subsequent versions. And that's because what is now known as the Dark Knight was originally called Makenshi, which translates to either Magic Swordsman or Demon Swordsman. The job could be obtained from the Water Crystal, and it's said that those who were able to master it did so after learning to harness the negative energies that flowed throughout the world around them. They possessed great strength and could wield dark blades as well as regular swords and daggers. They also had a strong association with dark and demonic armor, but in opposition to what was seen within Final Fantasy II, even though there was an association with magic, the job now had low intelligence, and that was because they could use white magic as opposed to black magic. Final Fantasy IV was where the Dark Knight came into its own, as for the initial part of the story, it was the job class associated with Cecil Harvey, the game's main protagonist. This built upon the narrative association seen within Final Fantasy II, as the alignment of Dark Knights with the side of evil was diminished. We did still see Cecil manipulated into committing atrocious acts against the Mysidian people, but whereas Leon showed no remorse after breaking away from the Emperor, Cecil was consumed by guilt and ended up rebelling against his king. From a gameplay perspective, Cecil had many similarities with the Magic Swordsman from Final Fantasy III. He had high strength and low intelligence, and was able to wield dark blades in isolation as well as a wider selection of dark armor, but there was no longer any association with magic, white or black. Cecil did, however, have a specific ability called Darkness. When used, it would see Cecil sacrifice 1/8 of his maximum HP to deal powerful non-elemental damage to all enemies. And from this point on, perhaps due to how unique it was, Darkness would become a signature ability for the class, featuring almost every time the Dark Knight resurfaced in one shape or another. But even though the Dark Knight had interesting applications from a narrative and gameplay perspective, its next appearance wouldn't be until Final Fantasy Tactics. In the original version of Tactics, Gothard Gafgarian was designated as a Dark Knight, and based on his various abilities and traits, as well as his personality, it was a fitting designation. Known to have committed great acts of barbarism throughout the 50 Years' War, Gafgarian seemed to have no conscience and would perform any act if the price was right. And when engaged in combat, his style was all about dominating his opponent and making them submit to his will. His two main abilities were Duskblade, also known as Dark Sword, and Shadowblade, also known as Night Sword. They would allow Gafgarian to absorb an opponent's MP and HP respectively, and were associated with the Dark element. And one of these moves would receive a high degree of prominence when the Dark Knight next appeared in Final Fantasy XI. Dark Knight was available pretty close to the launch of Final Fantasy XI as an advanced job, and it could be unlocked by completing the Blade of Darkness. This would involve the player using the Chaosbringer to slay 100 enemies, something that would activate the weapon's potential. Once acquired, the Dark Knight would end up being a very powerful class, and not long after its introduction, the developers ended up having to enact some significant nerfs to reduce its strength in comparison to some of the other jobs. This iteration of the Dark Knight regained the ability to use black magic, and they could also use dark magic. Because of this, they had relatively high intelligence alongside their high strength, something that mirrored what was seen with Leon in Final Fantasy II. They could also use swords and axes again, but they now had access to two new types of weapons, scythes and greatswords. Their array of dark armor was also expanded over the years thanks to the addition of various artifact, relic and Empyrean armor. But perhaps the most impactful aspect of the Dark Knight was its abilities. Unlike many of the other quintessential jobs, as Dark Knights did not appear between Final Fantasy IV and XI outside of Tactics, there was no real iterative progression, and it meant the developers who were working on Final Fantasy XI were afforded a lot more room to be creative. To further that, Darkness did not appear as one of the available moves, at least not in its original form. Darkness was instead morphed into a similar move called Soul Eater, which would see the player sacrifice 10% of their health to enhance the damage output of their next attack. Alongside this were a whole host of other complementary moves such as Last Resort, which would allow a Dark Knight to weaken their defense to bolster their attack, and Consume Mana, which would convert all available MP to again enhance attack. It meant Dark Knights could deal considerable amounts of damage, and if not moderated, the enmity the damage generated would lead to a quick death, as they would become the definition of a glass cannon. Still, Dark Knights weren't without their defensive qualities, as they gained resistance against unnatural forces through Arcane Circle, could use Weapon Bash to stun an enemy, and could also use Dark Seal to make sure their next dark magic spell landed with a high degree of certainty. And they could also fall back on their special ability, Blood Weapon. This referenced Gafgarian's Shadowblade, as it would allow Dark Knights to drain HP from their target with every attack. But now, as it was based over a duration of time, as opposed to being isolated to a single move, Blood Weapon was even more powerful, especially when combined with Soul Eater. After this very strong showing that helped to flesh out the Dark Knight, the next appearance was quite odd. As part of a quest in Final Fantasy Tactics Advance, players were tasked with tracking down a notorious Dark Knight called Grissom, who was the leader of the Red Wings, a nice nod back to Cecil from Final Fantasy IV. But upon starting the encounter, players would find that Grissom had been renamed to Glassum, and that even though he was technically a Dark Knight, he had much more in common with a Paladin. It meant the next actual appearance of a Dark Knight came in Final Fantasy X-2, as it could be obtained as early as Chapter 2 from the Bevelle Underground. With the dress sphere being found within a treasure chest, there was no connection with the narrative this time around, but what players gained access to was pure power. Dark Knights had enhanced strength, had access to black and dark magic, and could wield swords. They also had access to the signature move, Darkness, which, much like its original incarnation, would deal non-elemental damage to all enemies at a cost of the character's health. They also gained access to a rather extreme ability called Charon. Much like the self-destruct blue magic that had appeared in a few prior games, it would allow a Dark Knight to sacrifice all of their life to deal massive damage to all enemies, and it no doubt served as a nod to Charon from Greek mythology. Dark Knight was not a playable class in Crystal Chronicles, but it was again associated with the narrative. As the party ventured out in search of miasma, they would start to hear about a wayward soul known as the Black Knight. Once a noble soldier who wielded a spear, the Black Knight had been driven mad after having their memories stolen by Raim, and as the story concluded, the player would learn that the Black Knight who had caused so much pain and confusion was called Leon, a fitting ode to the original Dark Knight who was also driven to commit heinous acts after being manipulated by a higher power. Final Fantasy Tactics War of the Lions was another game that retconned Dark Knights into the mix. In the original game, the Dark Knight was exclusive to Gafgarian, but in War of the Lions, the developers made the job available to players, but only if they had Knight and Black Mage mastered, as well as Samurai, Dragoon, Geomancer and Ninja at level 8. Due to these severe requirements, Dark Knights possessed the highest attack power of any of the standard jobs, and it meant they could use their regular attacks to deal significant amounts of damage. They also gained an interesting assortment of abilities such as Sanguine Sword and Infernal Strike, which were carbon copies of Gafgarian's Duskblade and Shadowblade, as well as Crushing Blow, which was similar to Weapon Bash from Final Fantasy XI, except instead of inflicting the stun status, it applied Stop. The most powerful ability was called Abyssal Blade, and this evolved what had previously been seen with Darkness and Soul Eater. It would see the character sacrifice their own health to deal damage to a group of enemies, but it was now an area of effect move, and the enemies who were closest to the Dark Knight would take the most damage. When combined with Vehemence, a support ability that replicated Last Resort from Final Fantasy XI, it made Dark Knights fearsome warriors that could turn the tide in battle, and they were an interesting addition to the game. Final Fantasy Fables CHOCOBO'S dungeon featured the Dark Knight as a job class that could be unlocked after defeating Chroma Shade on the 30th floor of the Guardian of the Light. Much like its predecessors, this job class had enhanced attack power but reduced defensive capabilities to compensate, making them susceptible to enemy attacks if the fight was prolonged. To ensure the encounters were kept short, Dark Knights had an interesting array of abilities. Shadow was similar to Darkness, as it allowed the character to use their own HP to deal increased damage, but it now only affected one enemy as opposed to a selection. Covenant was similar to Last Resort and Vehemence, as it doubled attack power but halved defense, and much like Bloodsword and Shadowblade, Drainblade would allow the Dark Knight to sap HP from a single target. But there were also some new moves that evolved the application of the Dark Knight. Dark Breaker iterated on Weapon Bash and Crushing Blow to apply a knockback effect, and a stronger version called Dark Blade could also be used. An ability called Dark would allow for the casting of a dark elemental spell, and Nightmare inflicted sleep on all nearby targets. And then there was Chaos, which would allow a Dark Knight to drain HP from multiple enemies at once. It meant that even though Final Fantasy Fables CHOCOBO'S dungeon was the epitome of a spin-off, its take on the Dark Knight was rather solid, and the developers even added some new traits that would become parts of the tools of the trade in future iterations. The next major appearance of a Dark Knight came in Dissidia Final Fantasy, as Cecil was selected as the Warrior of Light to represent Final Fantasy IV, and the developers chose to have both Cecil's Dark Knight and Paladin job classes available to the player. When in his Dark Knight form, Cecil would deliver slow but powerful attacks, something that played into the wider traits of the class, and he would use a sword as well as a spear, an interesting inclusion as the only other Dark Knight to ever wield a spear was the Black Knight in Crystal Chronicles. Cecil would be able to employ numerous moves that had similar naming conventions to previous games, but due to the nature of the experience, very few had an application that matched. Minor changes were then made to Cecil's abilities in Duodecim, with a new HP attack called Shadowbringer that had its brave damage increased if Cecil was in his Dark Knight form, and it was much the same in Dissidia NT, although Dark Flame was adjusted to have Cecil sacrifice HP to create a wave of darkness. The next appearance for Dark Knights was in Final Fantasy IV Heroes of Light, where they were classified as Dark Fencers, yet despite the name change, their attributes and moveset were very closely aligned. They had a strong affinity with swords and axes, as well as a new weapon classification called short swords, and the strength attribute was boosted, whereas intelligence was relatively low. To build upon their attributes, Dark Fencers had numerous abilities that would see their damage output increased based on manipulating their HP. Darkside replicated what had been seen from Shadow in Final Fantasy Fables, as it allowed a character to sacrifice a pool of their health to deal increased damage, but only to a single target. Darker Side then upgraded the move to act more like the quintessential Darkness, as it would attack all foes as opposed to a single enemy. The Dark Fencer's third ability was called Eye for an Eye. It would see the character able to deal an attack that would increase as the character's HP decreased, and this referenced a move called Minus Strike that had appeared in Final Fantasy IX as part of Steiner's arsenal. And then there was Amok, an interesting evolution of Charon which had been seen in Final Fantasy X too, except instead of the Dark Fencer instantly sacrificing their life to deal considerable damage, they would use Dark Side repeatedly until all of their HP was consumed. In Final Fantasy Dimensions, the Dark Knight was appropriately aligned to the Warriors of Darkness as opposed to the Warriors of Light. It could be obtained towards the end of Act 2 upon the completion of A Blessing in Disguise, and in the initial sense they were necessary to progress as their dark swords were able to stop enemies from auto-reviving. This acted as an interesting reference back to the Final Fantasy III remake, as players were encouraged to use Dark Knights to bring a swift end to enemies that could replicate themselves. Alongside the appearance of Dark Swords, which had not been associated with Dark Knights since Final Fantasy IV, the class could also wield the typical swords and axes, and they were able to make use of numerous abilities from the Dark Knight's arsenal, while also adding a few new ones. From the outset, Dark Knights could use Darkness, and this would see a character consume 1/4 of their maximum HP to deal enhanced damage. But unlike previous iterations of the move, it now only attacked a single target, much like Shadow and Darkside, which had been seen in Final Fantasy Fables and 4 Heroes of Light respectively. What would normally be expected from Darkness was instead called Onyx Wave, as when used, it would consume 1/3 of the character's maximum HP to deal enhanced damage to all foes. In addition, Dark Knights could inflict curse and sap, and in an interesting twist, could now provoke enemies using draw attacks, something that would not be often encouraged due to how weak Dark Knights were to counterbalance their incredible damage output. To compensate, Dark Knights could use Absorb HP, which like the classic Blood Weapon attack would see HP drained when landing attacks, and Final Thrust, which had similar mechanics to Eye for an Eye, except instead of dealing more damage with lower HP, it would increase its chance of success. The final two abilities available were quite interesting. Ebony Slash built upon Dark from Final Fantasy Fables as it delivered a dark elemental strike, and Last Resort was an extreme throwback to its original appearance in Final Fantasy XI, as well as Charon. It would see the Dark Knight cast Doom on themselves, with their stats enhanced significantly until their death. Final Fantasy XIV featured an interesting iteration of the Dark Knight, as unlike every prior version of the job class, it was classified as a tank as opposed to being an out-and-out damage dealer. This meant that even though there were numerous traits still pulled through, Dark Knights were given an expanded array of abilities to help them adapt to their new function. As a consequence, it led to a fundamental change, as the notion of consuming HP to deal increased damage, a mainstay part of the class, was removed. Dark Knights were introduced in Heaven's Ward, and the class could be acquired by working first with an NPC known as Frey, and then an old friend of theirs called Sid. It would involve navigating an intense series of quests that would culminate in a fight against Moogles, and once the Dark Knight was obtained, there were some clear differences from the outset. Due to the link with Final Fantasy XI, Dark Knights had a strong affinity with greatswords, but now they were the only weapon type available to the class. They still had their customary affinity with dark armor though, and they featured high strength, but due to their classification as tanks, they also had high vitality, and this then played into their use in combat. As had been seen throughout the years, Dark Knights were given a mixture of abilities that were focused on a single target or multiple targets, while others provided extra utility, and another seldom used category also appeared, damage mitigation. Amongst these standard moves were those that drained HP and drained MP, but unlike prior games where these moves were quite isolated, in Final Fantasy XIV there were numerous variants. Siphon Strike, Blood Weapon, Delirium and Stalwart Soul all had the potential to restore MP either as part of their base application or through combo bonuses, and Soul Eater and Abyssal Drain then had the chance to restore HP while also dealing damage to the target. Due to the removal of the typical HP sacrifice mechanic, the blood gauge ended up being introduced in Stormblood. Certain moves would increase the blood gauge, and it could then be expended on moves like Quietus, Bloodspiller, and the rather interesting Living Shadow, which would see a Simulacrum summoned. But perhaps the most interesting move was Living Dead. Previous Dark Knights had gained access to numerous abilities that would bring about their demise, but Living Dead went beyond, allowing Dark Knights to continue fighting even if their HP dropped to 0. It would allow a Dark Knight to expend all of its efforts and draw all hate for a limited period of time without fear of death, but if the Dark Knight's health was not restored to maximum before the effect wore off, they would still end up perishing. Dark Knights were not explicitly featured in Final Fantasy Type 0, but based on the traits of her character, Seiss was a pretty strong candidate. Scythe was only able to use scythes, which were first associated with Dark Knights in Final Fantasy XI, and her unique feature was the ability to draw malice or hatred from her enemies, something that drew from the earlier associations with Dark Knights and negative emotions. This malice could then be used to deal damage to foes, but Scythe could also inflict negative status effects such as stop, poison and death, and she could also use drain. Throughout much of the Final Fantasy XIII trilogy, Dark Knights did not feature, but in Lightning Returns it was possible for Lightning to acquire the Dark Knight garb. It had a loose association with the story, as it could be obtained after completing the side quest called To Save the Sinless, and it featured two abilities, Darkness and Ashura. The initial move, Darkness, was quintessential, as it allowed Lightning to consume her HP to deal a powerful area of effect attack, and Ashura built upon Darkbreaker from Final Fantasy Fables, but instead of causing knockback, it caused knock-up. Record Keeper featured numerous job classes as independent playable characters, and Dark Knight was one of the classes chosen. Due to this designation, Dark Knights were subpar in the grand scheme of things, with poor stats and limited application, but numerous traits were still apparent. They had enhanced attack, and could wield swords, axes and daggers, but they could also wield hammers, something that had never happened before. In combat, Dark Knights could use Dark Blade, which was now made similar to Blood Weapon, but it was much weaker, only offering a small chance to drain HP upon dealing damage. The Dark Knight's Soul Break was also called Dark Blade, and it acted in a similar manner to Shadow, with HP being sacrificed to deal enhanced damage to a single target. Unlike its predecessor, Final Fantasy Dimensions 2 did not have a clear and obvious job class system, but Parai did exhibit some traits associated with Dark Knights and acted somewhat like the tank variant seen in Final Fantasy XIV. Featuring high strength, Parai was able to deal considerable damage, and it was aligned with a variety of elements. But there was also the ability to mitigate damage through the use of full defense and retain HP and MP through Fixer Upper. Parai could also use Seal to stun an opponent, similar to Weapon Bash and Low Blow from Final Fantasy XI and XIV respectively, as well as Taunt, which would draw enemy attacks. But perhaps the biggest clue was Parai's access to Darkness, a move that not only sacrificed 1/5 of their maximum HP to deal enhanced physical damage, but was also now noted as being effective against demons. Parai could also use Dark Gar Assault, which evolved Dark and Ebony Assault, moves previously seen in Final Fantasy Fables and the original Dimensions. Dark Knight appeared as a powerful damage-dealing class in Final Fantasy Explorers, and it can be unlocked after defeating 500 enemies, at least not back to Final Fantasy XI. In its initial form, Dark Knights could wield swords, axes and scythes, but after being mastered, they could also use dual axes, dual swords, and spears, an association seldom seen outside of Crystal Chronicles and Dissidia. Their standout attribute was strength, and their main ability was darkness. As had been seen many times before, using Darkness would sacrifice HP to deal enhanced damage, but the move was now evolved as it could also steal attack and defense. The move could also now be charged, which would allow players to control how much HP was consumed with each use of the ability. In Mobius, Dark Knight appeared as an evolved form of the Onion Knight starter job card, and it was introduced as part of Job Batch 2 halfway through 2016. When utilised, Dark Knights had decent attack and high break power, and their ultimate, called Chaos Bringer, dealt massive damage in a cone shape with an added drain effect. Due to the nature of the experience, Brave Exvius has featured numerous Dark Knights, with the most obvious being Cecil, but Luneth also appeared as a Dark Knight, and Dwayne, an original character, also featured some of the more obvious traits. Each of them could use the classic Darkness ability, which now sacrificed HP to deal enhanced dark elemental damage to all enemies. Cecil could also access upgraded versions of the move, including Dark Cannon and Soul Eater, with the latter sacrificing 49% of health to deal 3.2 times more damage to a single enemy. Each of them also had access to abilities that allowed them to drain HP from their target. Cecil could use Drain Blade, Luneth could use Bloodthirsty Sword, which also drained MP, and Dwayne had access to the standard Drain spell. But outside of that, it was Dark Luneth that took the Dark Knight further. Not only did he have a passive ability called Immortal Power that, similar to Living Dead from Final Fantasy XIV, allowed him to ignore fatal damage, but he also had a huge amount of Dark Blade moves that could provide a variety of positive status effects, including one that healed party members. Cecil then reappeared in Opera Omnia, and each of his moves drew from previous Dissidia appearances. However, their application was now changed to adapt to the PvE setting. It meant Darkness and Valiant Blow now consumed HP upon use, and in the case of the latter, it also mirrored Dark Breaker from Final Fantasy Fables by adding a knockback effect. In War of the Visions, Dwayne returned, and this time he was classified as a Dark Knight of Remorse. It meant many of his abilities were associated with the Dark Elemental effect, but while abilities such as Darkness returned, and there was a notion of absorbing HP based on damage dealt, there was no consumption of HP associated with the class. Dwayne was not the only Dark Knight of note to appear in War of the Visions though. Gafgarion, for example, appeared as part of the Final Fantasy Tactics event quest. Unlike Dwayne, Gafgarion, who was assigned the Fell Knight class, would still sacrifice his HP using Abyssal Blade and Unholy Sacrifice to deal heavy damage across an area. He could also use Vehemence, which was introduced in War of the Lions, to increase attack and decrease defense, and Duskblade and Shadowblade both returned, now stealing TP and HP respectively, instead of MP and HP. Another example was Stern, who was classified as a Knight of Ruin. They also possessed abilities that would sacrifice their own health to deal damage and lower the defense of their targets. And that brings us on to the final entry into our list, the Final Fantasy III Pixel Remaster, which changed the ability associated with Dark Knights yet again. It has seen Soul Eater now replaced with a new move called Blade Blitz. It still allows the Dark Knight to unleash an attack that deals damage to all targets, but the sacrifice of HP is no longer necessary, something that builds upon the recent trend. And that wraps up this evolutionary topic. We'd love to hear your thoughts about how the Dark Knight has evolved over the years, and if you enjoyed the study, please consider giving us a like. Make sure you also let us know which job class you'd like us to tackle next, and if you enjoy what we do and would like to support the channel, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. You can find out more information at patreon.com/FFunion. Alright guys, with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Reigning Eckham, Benjamin Snow and Gregory, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.